On Christmas Eve, a storm buried a small mountain town in silence. A lonely police officer finished his shift with nowhere to go. A retired German shepherd refused to move, and inside a diner, an old man sat alone, carrying a lifetime of service and loss. No radio call came that night, yet something far greater answered. This is a story about duty that never ends, about loyalty that outlives pain, and about how even in the coldest winters, hope still finds a way. Before the story begins, tell us where you are watching from and what Christmas means to you. Leave it in the comments, and if stories of faith, courage, and second chances matter to you, please press subscribe to support this channel and walk this journey with us. Christmas Eve settled heavily over Redwood Falls, Montana, a mountain town tucked between dark pine ridges and a frozen river that locals claimed never truly slept. Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, thick and deliberate, the kind that muted sound and softened even the sharpest regrets. Along Main Street, Christmas lights were strung from lamppost to lamppost, their colors wavering in the wind like stubborn little prayers. Storefront windows glowed with wreaths and handwritten holiday signs. But the sidewalks were mostly empty now. The cold had driven people indoors, toward warmth, family, and tables already set. The temperature hovered near -10, and the air carried that metallic stillness that came just before a deeper freeze. Officer Daniel Carter, 39 years old, guided his patrol vehicle slowly down the street, tires crunching against compacted snow. Daniel was tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean build shaped by years of night shifts, skipped meals, and disciplined routines that never quite filled the spaces grief had carved out. His dark hair was cut short in the regulation style, already threaded with early gray at the temples. His face carried the kind of quiet severity that came not from anger, but from endurance. People in town described him as polite, reserved, unfailingly respectful. They also said he had changed 2 years ago, after his wife died of cancer. Before, Daniel had been quicker to smile, quicker to talk. After, he became a man who listened more than he spoke, as if words were something precious and easily wasted. The shift had ended 10 minutes earlier, but Daniel did not turn toward the road that led home. Home was a small rented house on the edge of town, clean and orderly and painfully silent. Tonight, like many nights since the loss, he felt no urgency to return. Instead, his eyes flicked briefly to the passenger seat. There lay Hawk, an 8-year-old German shepherd, retired K9. Hawk was large even for his breed, with a broad chest, powerful shoulders, and a thick sable and black coat that had dulled slightly with age. His eyes were amber, alert but calm, carrying the steady intelligence of a dog that had learned the difference between chaos and command. His left ear bore a narrow scar, a pale line of missing fur from an old search and rescue mission during a blizzard years earlier. Officially, Hawk had been retired after that operation. Unofficially, Daniel never stopped working with him. Hawk's temperament was steady, almost solemn, but there was gentleness beneath it, a sensitivity to human emotion that had made him invaluable not just in police work, but in moments when words failed. Daniel slowed near Miller's Diner, the largest restaurant in Redwood Falls and the only one still open past 9 on holidays. Through the wide front windows, he could see families crowded into booths, couples leaning toward each other, steam rising from mugs and plates. Laughter spilled out in brief, bursts whenever the door opened. Hawk lifted his head slightly, ears angling forward, not in excitement, but awareness. Daniel parked along the curb. He had no intention of eating. All he wanted was a cup of warm water for Hawk. The cold had deepened faster than expected, and even a dog as resilient as Hawk needed relief. Daniel adjusted his jacket, stepped out into the wind, and felt the bite of the air settle immediately into his bones. Before he reached the door, the diner's manager came out. Robert Hayes, mid-50s, stocky, with thinning hair and a perpetually tense expression, had run Miller's for over a decade. He was efficient, rule-oriented, and not unkind, but tonight his patience was thin. Christmas Eve brought crowds, complaints, and long hours. "Sorry, officer," Robert said, eyes flicking past Daniel to the dog in the car. "No dogs inside. We're packed." Daniel nodded without argument. He had expected this. "I understand," he said evenly. "I was just hoping for some warm water. I won't bring him in." Robert hesitated, then shook his head. "Health code. I can't." Daniel thanked him anyway. There was no irritation in his voice, only resignation. He turned back toward the patrol car, breath fogging the air. That was when Hawk froze. The dog did not bark or pull. He simply stopped moving, muscles tightening subtly beneath his coat. Daniel felt it instantly, the way handlers do after years of working with the same animal. He turned back. Hawk's gaze was fixed through the diner window, toward a corner table near the glass where condensation blurred the world beyond. There sat an elderly man alone. The man was Franklin Moore, 74 years old. Though time had worn him in ways numbers rarely captured, he was broad-shouldered even now, though age and illness had thinned him. His hair was white and neatly combed, his face lined deeply, especially around the eyes. He wore a dark wool coat draped over the back of his wheelchair and kept his hands folded in his lap, fingers interlaced as if holding something fragile. His posture was upright, disciplined, the posture of a man who had once given orders and expected them to be followed. Yet there was a loneliness about him, quiet and contained, like a room kept closed for too long. Franklin had been the sheriff of Redwood Falls for 30 years. Most people in town still called him sheriff, out of habit and respect. 6 years earlier, a stroke had taken his ability to walk. Not long after, his wife passed away, and his adult daughter moved out of state. None of it had been dramatic. Loss, for Franklin, had come in small, steady withdrawals. Inside the diner, Franklin stared out at the snow, his untouched plate cooling in front of him. Hawk stepped forward, just once. "Easy," Daniel murmured automatically, his voice low and calm. He gave the hand signal for halt. Hawk did not disobey. He paused, then adjusted his path slightly, angling, closer to the window, his body language soft and non-threatening. Years of therapy training resurfaced not as commands, but as instinct. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Hawk had done this before, not often, only when something was wrong. Through the glass, Franklin noticed the dog. Their eyes met, man and animal, in that strange, wordless way that bypassed pride and history. Hawk sat down slowly, directly in Franklin's line of sight, and tilted his head. Something in Franklin's face shifted. He raised a hand slightly, palm open, a gesture once used to calm nervous deputies and frightened witnesses alike. Robert, the manager, noticed and hurried back over, irritation ready on his tongue. "It's all right," Franklin said, before Robert could speak. His voice was slow, but firm, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Bring them some towels, and warm water." Robert hesitated, then nodded, caught between policy and memory. Daniel remained outside for a moment longer, snow gathering on his shoulders. He looked at Hawk, then at the old man inside. The radio at his shoulder was silent, no call, no directive, yet somehow the night had spoken anyway. Inside Miller's diner, warmth pressed gently against the cold that clung to coats and bones, but it could not fully erase the winter that people carried within them. The air smelled of coffee, gravy, and pine-scented cleaner, layered with the faint sweetness of cinnamon from the holiday pies cooling near the counter. Outside, snow continued its patient descent, brushing the windows like a hand unwilling to leave. Franklin Moore sat in his wheelchair by the fog glass, exactly where he had asked to be seated every Christmas Eve for the past 4 years. The chair was sturdy and practical, dark steel with worn armrests polished smooth by time and use. Franklin himself was tall even seated, his posture straight, shoulders squared, as if an invisible badge still rested on his chest. His hands, large and veined, bore the marks of a lifetime of work, old scars across the knuckles, a faint tremor in the fingers that came and went without warning. His face, deeply lined, carried both sternness and restraint, the kind shaped by decades of responsibility. People who knew him well understood that Franklin was not a hard man by nature, but duty had taught him discipline before tenderness. When the stroke took his legs 6 years earlier, it did not merely paralyze his body. It forced stillness upon a man who had lived in motion. Patrol routes, emergency calls, long nights behind a desk lit by a single lamp. The silence that followed was heavier than any physical limitation. Friends visited at first, then less often. His wife passed away quietly 2 winters later. His daughter left town after the funeral, saying she needed space, promising to visit. Promises, Franklin had learned, were fragile things. Tonight, his plate sat nearly untouched, He had ordered out of habit, not hunger. Through the glass, Franklin noticed the German shepherd sitting outside, snow dusting the thick fur along its back. The dog's stillness struck him. This was not a restless animal tugging at a leash or begging for attention. This was a working dog at rest, alert without tension, present without demand. Its amber eyes met Franklin's, and something deep and instinctive stirred in his chest. The manager, Robert Hayes, returned with towels and a metal bowl of warm water, his movements brisk but subdued. He set them just inside the door, glancing at Franklin for confirmation. Franklin nodded once. That was enough. Outside, Officer Daniel Carter hesitated only a moment before opening the passenger door. Hawk stepped down carefully, paws sinking into fresh snow. Daniel followed, tall frame casting a long shadow under the diner's lights. He kept the leash loose, his grip relaxed but ready, the posture of a handler who trusted his partner without surrendering responsibility. As they entered, conversations quieted briefly. Redwood Falls was a town accustomed to uniforms and dogs, but the combination still carried weight. Daniel removed his hat, nodding politely to the nearest table, his expression neutral, respectful. Hawk moved beside him, gait measured, tail low but steady. Franklin watched them approach. Up close he could see that Daniel was younger than he had first thought, though grief had aged him. The officer's face held a calm seriousness, eyes attentive without being intrusive. This was a man trained to observe without judgment, to stand between danger and those who could not. Hawk stopped directly in front of Franklin, just close enough to be felt. Without waiting for instruction, the dog lowered his head gently onto Franklin's knee. Franklin inhaled sharply. He had not felt his legs since the stroke. Not pain, not pressure, not even cold. Doctors explained it in clinical terms, nerve damage, loss of sensory pathways, but explanations did little to prepare a man for the absence of his own body. Yet now, through fabric and bone and memory, Franklin felt weight. Not physical sensation, perhaps, but recognition. The presence of something alive, grounded, unafraid to rest against him. Daniel's hand lifted instinctively, ready to correct, but he stopped himself. Hawk was not breaking protocol. He was following another kind of training, older, quieter. "I'm sorry," Daniel said softly, his voice low so as not to draw attention. He usually waits for permission. Franklin looked up at him. His eyes were sharp, still capable of assessing men in seconds. "He's doing his job," Franklin replied. His voice was slow, deliberate, but steady. "Aren't you, boy?" Hawk did not move. His ears remained relaxed, his breathing even. A memory rose unbidden in Franklin's mind. A night in 1989. A snowstorm that turned roads into white tunnels. A patrol car overturned in a ditch, its young officer trapped inside, bleeding and terrified. Franklin, then sheriff in his 40s, kneeling in snow so deep it burned, hauling the door open with numb hands. The weight of that young man leaning against him afterward, shaking but alive. The same weight, the same certainty. "You can sit," Franklin said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from him. "It's a long night." Daniel hesitated only briefly before sitting. He guided Hawk to lie beside Franklin's chair, the dog's body angled protectively, his flank still touching Franklin's knee. Daniel noticed the subtle change in Hawk's breathing, the deep, content rhythm that came only when the dog sensed safety on both sides. Robert returned quietly with a fresh cup of coffee for Franklin and another bowl of water placed discreetly near Hawk. He said nothing, only offered a small nod before retreating behind the counter. Franklin studied Daniel now, not as a customer studies a stranger, but as a commander studies an officer. He noted the way Daniel kept his shoulders squared, even seated, the way his eyes tracked the room without appearing to, the faint tightness in his jaw that suggested a man accustomed to swallowing words. "Carter," Franklin said, glancing briefly at the name stitched on Daniel's uniform. "Daniel Carter." "Yes, sir," Daniel replied out of habit before correcting himself. "Mr. Moore." Franklin allowed himself a small smile. "Old habits," he said. "They stay longer than they should." Silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Hawk shifted slightly, pressing more firmly against Franklin's leg. "I used to think," Franklin said after a while, eyes returning to the snow, "that once you stop feeling something, It's gone for good. Daniel listened, sensing the weight behind the words. He did not interrupt. But sometimes, Franklin continued, resting a hand on Hawk's broad head, fingers sinking into thick fur. The body forgets, the soul doesn't. Hawk's tail thumped once, slow and solid. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He thought of his wife, of the nights when her absence felt like a physical ache, sharp and undeniable. He thought of the radio calls he still heard in his sleep, the ones he could never answer again. Outside, Christmas lights flickered as the snow deepened. No call came through the radio, but none was needed. The storm outside softened briefly, as if pausing to listen. Miller's diner grew quieter as the dinner rush thinned. Families paid their checks, bundled children into coats, and disappeared into the snow. Plates were cleared, chairs scraped softly against the floor. The world narrowed until only a few tables remained occupied, islands of light in a sea of winter darkness. Christmas music played low through the speakers, an old recording crackling slightly with age. Franklin Moore watched Officer Daniel Carter in the same way he once watched new deputies during their first night shift, not with suspicion, but with deliberate attention. Franklin had learned long ago that men revealed more in small gestures than in grand statements. Daniel sat with his back straight but not rigid, hands relaxed near his knees, his body angled slightly toward Hawk without hovering. When a server passed too close, Daniel shifted subtly, placing himself between the movement and the dog, not out of fear, but habit, protection without announcement. Daniel noticed Franklin's hand trembling slightly as he reached for his fork. Without a word, Daniel leaned forward and adjusted the plate, cutting the meat into manageable pieces with calm efficiency. He did not rush. He did not draw attention. When he finished, he returned the fork to Franklin's hand as if nothing unusual had occurred. Franklin felt something tighten behind his eyes. It had been years since someone helped him, without making it feel like charity. "Thank you," Franklin said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "Of course." Franklin resumed eating, slow but steady. Hawk remained beside him, the dogs breathing deep and even. The warmth of the animal's body radiated through Franklin's coat, anchoring him in the moment. "You didn't grow up here?" Franklin said after a while, not a question. "No, sir," Daniel replied. "Moved here 12 years ago. My wife got a teaching position at the elementary school." Franklin glanced at him then, catching the subtle pause before the word wife. He did not press. He understood pauses. "Redwood Falls has a way of keeping the ones who stay," Franklin said, "and breaking the ones who don't." Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "I've noticed." Franklin shifted slightly in his wheelchair, adjusting his posture. "You ever been to the old station?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Before my time." "Edge of town," Franklin said. "Near the river bend. That building remembers things." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued but silent. Franklin leaned back, eyes unfocusing as memory took hold. "That station was built in the 70s. Concrete, brick, nothing fancy. But every wall in that place heard confessions, last words, promises made at 3 a.m, men coming back from calls they weren't sure they should have survived." He paused, fingers curling slightly against the armrest. "That was my last post, my final night as sheriff." Daniel listened intently now, sensing the weight of what was coming. "They're planning to tear it down," Franklin continued. "City council approved a proposal, winter resort, ski tourists, big money." He exhaled slowly. "I don't blame them. Towns like this survive on reinvention." "But," Daniel said gently, sensing the unspoken resistance. "But that building doesn't deserve to be erased," Franklin said. His voice remained calm, but something firm settled beneath it. "Not without purpose." Franklin turned his gaze fully on Daniel. "I want to turn it into something else." Daniel waited. "Second watch," Franklin said. The words hung between them, solid and deliberate. "A place for retired officers, veterans, firefighters, K-9s like him." Franklin nodded toward Hawk. "Men and women who served, then came home with nowhere to stand. Not charity housing, not a shelter, a post, a continuation." Daniel felt a slow chill run through him, not from the cold, but recognition. He had seen men like that, men who woke at dawn without orders, who missed the weight of responsibility more than the danger. He was one of them, though he still wore the uniform. Franklin continued, I've been working on it quietly. Permits, structural assessments, private funding. A faint smile crossed his face. I learned politics early. You don't announce until you must. Daniel nodded, impressed despite himself. Why tell me? Franklin's gaze sharpened. Because I've been watching you. Daniel stiffened slightly. Not like that, Franklin said, catching the reaction. Public records, town logs, incident reports. He tapped the table lightly. You never escalate unless you must. You de-escalate when others want force. You treat the drunk, the homeless, the angry like they matter. You don't talk about it, you just do it. Daniel felt heat creep into his neck. Praise unsettled him more than criticism. I've seen plenty of good talkers, Franklin continued, but leadership is quieter. It shows up when no one's watching. Hawk lifted his head briefly, ears flicking, then settled again. Outside, the wind rose, sending a fresh wave of snow against the windows. The lights flickered but held. Franklin's voice softened. I don't have the strength to run it, not anymore, and when I'm gone, he trailed off, then continued with deliberate calm. I need someone who understands that service doesn't end when the badge comes off. Daniel swallowed. He thought of his wife's empty classroom desk, of Hawk's retirement papers, of his own fear of the day when the uniform would no longer fit his life. I don't know if I'm the right person, Daniel said honestly. Franklin smiled, small and knowing. That's usually how you can tell. A sudden gust shook the diner, rattling the door. Snow swirled outside, thickening again. The storm was returning, stronger this time. Franklin glanced toward the window. Weather's turning. Daniel followed his gaze. Years of patrol had trained his instincts. Harder than forecasted, he said. Roads will ice soon. Franklin nodded. The old station's roof isn't finished being reinforced. Contractors wanted to wait until after the holidays. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's risky. Yes, Franklin agreed. But risk doesn't scare me. Neglect does. For a moment, neither spoke. Hawk shifted, rising to his feet. Ears forward now, body alert. Not alarmed, but attentive. Daniel noticed immediately. What is it, boy? He murmured. Hawk did not bark. He simply looked toward the door, then back at Franklin. Franklin met the dog's gaze and smiled faintly. Always watching? He said. Good habit. The radio on Daniel's shoulder crackled briefly, static, then silence. No call. Yet outside, the storm gathered itself, winding tighter around Redwood Falls, as if preparing to test what men chose to protect. The building Franklin spoke of still stood, waiting. And so did the watch. By the time Daniel Carter stepped back outside, the storm had found its voice. Wind tore through Redwood Falls with a low, constant howl, sweeping snow sideways across the streets and erasing the faint tracks left by earlier traffic. The mountains surrounding the town disappeared behind shifting white curtains, their dark outlines swallowed whole. Christmas lights along Main Street flickered, then steadied, as if refusing to be frightened into darkness. The temperature dropped another few degrees, sharp enough to sting exposed skin within seconds. Daniel stood beside his patrol car, collar pulled high, one gloved hand resting lightly on Hawk's leash. The dog's posture had changed. Hawk was no longer relaxed or contemplative. His body was aligned forward, ears erect, weight balanced evenly on all four paws. This was not anxiety. It was readiness. Inside the diner, Franklin Moore watched the storm through the fogged glass, his expression unreadable. He had seen storms like this before, storms that turned routine calls into life-and-death decisions. The kind that stripped away comfort and exposed what people were truly willing to stand for. Franklin rolled his wheelchair closer to the window. That's not just weather, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. That's a test. Daniel nodded, eyes scanning the street, instinctively assessing conditions. The forecast underestimated it, he said. If it keeps building, we'll have road closures within the hour. Franklin's jaw tightened. And the old station? Daniel hesitated. You said the roof reinforcement wasn't finished. It wasn't, Franklin confirmed. Temporary supports only. The contractors plan to return after Christmas. The implications settled heavily between them. Franklin reached for his phone, fingers steady despite the tremor that came with fatigue. Messages had already begun to arrive, emails from city officials, notifications from legal advisors, reminders of meetings postponed and decisions delayed. Over the past week, opposition to the Second Watch project had grown louder. Investors pushed for speed. A particular city councilman, Gerald Whitmore, a well-dressed man in his early 60s with a polished smile and little patience for sentiment, had argued openly that Franklin's vision was financially impractical. There were whispers now, suggestions that Franklin's health made him unfit to oversee any project at all. Franklin exhaled slowly. Politics he could handle. Weather was another matter. Daniel's radio crackled briefly, then went silent again. No emergency dispatch, no directive. Still, he felt the pull. "I should check on the station," Daniel said at last. Franklin turned to him, studying his face. "I didn't ask you to." "I know," Daniel replied. "But if that roof gives way, the building's gone. And with it, your permits, your inspections, everything you've already fought for." Franklin was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You think like an officer," he said, "not a hero." Daniel allowed a faint, almost wry smile. "Heroes make speeches. Officers make plans." Minutes later, Daniel's patrol vehicle cut through the storm, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the snow. Hawk rode alert in the passenger seat, muscles taut, eyes fixed ahead. Redwood Falls felt smaller now, its streets narrowed by drifts, its familiar landmarks half hidden. Christmas decorations bent under the accumulating weight, some collapsing quietly into the snow. The old police station sat at the edge of town, near the river bend Franklin had described. A squat concrete and brick structure, utilitarian and unadorned, it looked almost defiant against the storm, as if refusing to acknowledge how close it stood to being forgotten. Temporary scaffolding hugged one side of the building, its metal bars groaning faintly as the wind pressed against them. Daniel parked carefully, angling the car to shield the entrance from the worst of the wind. He stepped out, boots sinking deep, snow immediately filling the impressions he left behind. Hawk followed, head low, tail steady, moving with practiced efficiency. Inside, the station smelled of dust, old paper, and cold concrete. The lights flickered, then stabilized. Exposed beams overhead showed signs of strain, hairline cracks, subtle shifts where weight pressed unevenly. Daniel's breath fogged the air. "We've got movement in the main support," he muttered, more to himself than to Hawk. He reached for his radio, switching to a local channel. "This is Officer Carter. I'm at the old station on River Bend. We've got structural stress due to the storm. I need anyone nearby with construction or emergency experience." The response was slow, but it came. Within 30 minutes, figures emerged from the storm like ghosts answering a call they hadn't expected. Thomas Reed, a retired firefighter in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and stubbornly cheerful despite frost clinging to his beard. Elena Vasquez, a veterinarian in her 40s, slim and sharp-eyed, who had treated half the town's animals and refused to stay home when she heard a K-9 was involved. 2 former patrol officers arrived as well, their movements slower than they once were, but no less deliberate. No one asked about pay, no one asked about liability. They asked only, "What needs holding?" Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the danger. He issued clear, professional instructions. "Primary beam first. We reinforce the load-bearing points. Ignore anything cosmetic. If it doesn't hold the structure up, it's not our priority." They worked in silence, broken only by the wind and the creak of metal. Hawk moved among them, careful not to interfere, positioning himself instinctively where people paused, leaning briefly against knees or boots, grounding, frayed nerves with quiet presence. Franklin arrived shortly after, transported by a town volunteer who had refused to let him stay behind. He watched from just inside the doorway, blanket pulled tight around his legs, eyes sharp despite the cold. Hawk went to him immediately, pressing close, as if resuming a post left unfinished. The storm intensified. A deep, ominous crack echoed through the building as part of the roof structure gave way. Snow and debris crashed down along the far wall, sending a plume of white dust into the air. For a moment, everyone froze. "Hold!" Daniel shouted. Not in panic, but command. They did. Supports groaned, but the reinforced frame resisted. The building shuddered, then steadied. Franklin closed his eyes briefly, a silent prayer forming without words. He felt Hawk's weight against his chair, solid and unyielding. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the storm's rage began to loosen its grip. the wind's howl easing into a low moan. Snow continued to fall, but the worst had spent itself. The old station still stood, exhausted, cold, and silent. The small group gathered in the dim light, breath steaming, hands numb. No one cheered, no one claimed victory. They had simply held the line. Franklin looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, and something settled in his chest. This was what he had hoped for. Not a building saved by money or influence, but by people who understood what it meant to stay when leaving was easier. Outside, snow piled high against the walls, sealing the station in white. Inside, the frame remained upright, scarred but unbroken. The storm had come to answer doubts, resistance, and fear. And Redwood Falls, for now, had answered back. Morning came to Redwood Falls without ceremony. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a town reshaped by snow and silence. Drifts leaned against doors and vehicles like pale barricades. Pine branches bowed low, creaking softly under their burden. The sky was a flat, washed-out gray, the kind that made it difficult to tell where clouds ended and mountains began. Christmas morning should have felt gentle, but the air carried tension, the aftermath of something narrowly survived. Daniel Carter had not gone home. He stood outside the old station just after dawn, breath fogging in slow, steady clouds, staring at the building they had held together through the night. The concrete walls bore fresh scars where debris had struck. Temporary supports crisscrossed the exterior like bandages on an injured body. It was standing, but only just. Hawk sat beside him, snow dusting the dog's back, ears alert, but relaxed now that the danger had receded. The German shepherd looked older in the daylight. Gray threaded his muzzle more clearly than it had the night before. His movements were still strong, but Daniel noticed the stiffness when Hawk rose after sitting too long. Time did not rush dogs the way it rushed men, but it always arrived. Behind them, Franklin Moore was being helped into his wheelchair van by a volunteer. The former sheriff looked exhausted. The strain of the night had deepened the lines in his face, and his hands shook more noticeably now. Yet his eyes were clear, alive with purpose. "You should go home," Franklin said, as he noticed Daniel still standing guard. "You've been up all night." Daniel nodded, but did not move. In a bit. Franklin studied him carefully. He had seen that look before, in men who had stayed too long in the fire because leaving felt like failure. "You did your part," Franklin said. "More than your part." Daniel met his gaze. "So did you." Franklin allowed a thin smile. "Mine was easier. I didn't have to climb anything." Daniel almost laughed, but the sound caught in his chest. He looked at Hawk instead, resting a gloved hand briefly on the dog's broad head. By midday, the town began to stir again. Plows worked slowly through the streets. News of the storm damage spread quickly, along with word that the old station still stood. For some, it was a minor headline. For others, an inconvenience. For a few, particularly those who had once worn uniforms, it meant something harder to name. And with the daylight came pressure. Franklin's phone rang continuously. City council members, legal representatives, investors. There were questions now, urgent, sharp-edged questions. Why had civilians been allowed on site during unsafe conditions? Why had a retired officer been present at all? Why had an active duty officer participated without formal authorization? One call came from Gerald Whitmore, the councilman who had opposed Second Watch most fiercely. His voice was smooth, concerned in tone, but precise in aim. He spoke of liability, of mental fitness, of responsibility. By the afternoon, Franklin's attorney arrived in person. "There's a petition being drafted," the attorney said quietly, standing near the window of Franklin's living room. "They're questioning your capacity to manage this project. They're citing the stroke, your presence at the site during the storm." Franklin closed his eyes briefly. He had known this was coming. "And Daniel?" he asked. The attorney hesitated. "They're asking why an officer with a personal connection to you was involved. They'll imply undue influence." Franklin's jaw tightened. He opened his eyes and looked across the room, where Daniel sat on the edge of a chair, Hawk lying at his feet. Daniel had heard enough. "This is my fault," Daniel said quietly. Franklin snapped his gaze back to him. "No," he said firmly. "This is politics." Daniel shook his head. "It's more than that. As long as I'm here, they have leverage. They can frame this as emotional decision-making, favoritism. They can stall the permits indefinitely. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. Hawk lifted his head, ears twitching, sensing the shift. Daniel stood slowly. At 39, he felt older than his years in moments like this. The uniform that once anchored him now felt heavy, almost out of place. "I need to step away," Daniel said. Franklin's breath caught. "Daniel," temporarily, Daniel added, though the word tasted hollow. "I'll hand things over to the interim team. I won't disappear, but if I stay visible, they'll keep pushing you. And if they succeed..." He trailed off. Franklin understood what Daniel could not bring himself to say. The project would die quietly, not because it lacked merit, but because its founder had been deemed inconvenient. Franklin reached out, gripping the armrest of his wheelchair tightly. "You're asking me to accept protection by absence." Daniel met his eyes. "I'm asking you to let me do my job." For a long moment, Franklin said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. The motion seemed to cost him more than it should have. "Officers withdraw when the mission demands it," Franklin said, voice low. "Not when they want to." Daniel swallowed. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Daniel returned once more to Franklin's porch. Snow had begun falling again, lighter this time, almost hesitant. He did not knock. Instead, he placed 2 items carefully beside the door. His old badge, polished but worn, its edges softened by years of use, and Hawk's rubber ball, faded and cracked, the one constant through training fields, long patrols, and lonely nights. It was not abandonment, it was a report of withdrawal. Daniel left before Franklin could see him. The discovery came at dawn. Franklin's caregiver found the items first and brought them inside. When Franklin saw them, confusion flickered across his face, then understanding, then shock. His heart, already weakened, faltered under the weight of it all. The sudden loss, layered upon exhaustion and stress, struck hard. By the time the ambulance arrived, Franklin was barely conscious. Across town, Hawk lifted his head suddenly, ears snapping to attention. He let out a low whine, unfamiliar and urgent. Daniel, already halfway packed in his small house, froze. The police radio crackled on the counter. "Medical emergency. Redwood Falls General. ICU admission." Daniel did not wait for details. He drove through falling snow, Hawk rigid in the passenger seat, eyes fixed ahead. At the hospital, bright lights cut through the gray morning. The smell of antiseptic replaced pine and cold. In the ICU, Franklin lay pale against white sheets, monitors humming softly around him. His breathing was shallow but steady. Daniel stood at the doorway, uncertain, suddenly stripped of all authority by fear. Hawk moved past him without hesitation. The German shepherd approached the bed, placed his head gently on Franklin's hand, and stayed there. Minutes passed, then Franklin's fingers twitched. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with effort. They found Hawk first, then Daniel. A faint smile touched his lips. "Officer Carter," Franklin whispered, voice fragile but unmistakably clear. "Return to your post." Daniel exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for years. Outside the ICU window, snow continued to fall, and the watch, though shaken, had not ended. Snow fell gently over Redwood Falls on Christmas morning, no longer driven by rage or urgency, but by patience. The storm that had threatened to tear the town apart now seemed almost apologetic, laying a quiet white blanket over rooftops, sidewalks, and pine branches. The mountains reappeared in the distance, softened by mist and light, standing like ancient witnesses who had seen far worse and endured. Inside Redwood Falls General Hospital, the ICU hummed with steady, controlled life. Machines beeped softly, lights glowed low, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with faint traces of pine from the small Christmas wreaths nurses had taped to doors. It was a place suspended between endings and beginnings. Franklin Moore lay in his hospital bed, thinner now, his skin pale against crisp white sheets. Tubes and monitors framed him, but his eyes were open, alert, and unmistakably present. Age and illness had weakened his body, but his mind, his command, remained intact. Years of leadership had taught him how to wake inside crisis, how to gather himself even when strength felt borrowed. At his bedside stood Daniel Carter, uniform rumpled, eyes shadowed by exhaustion and fear he had not allowed himself to acknowledge until now. Hawk lay on the floor beside the bed, his large frame curled protectively, head resting against the mattress. The German shepherd's breathing was slow and deep, each rise and fall a quiet promise that he was not leaving this post. "You scared the hell out of everyone," Daniel said softly, attempting a smile that didn't quite form. Franklin's lips curved faintly. "Good," he murmured. "Means they still care." Daniel shook his head, emotion tightening his throat. "You shouldn't have had to go through this." Franklin's gaze sharpened slightly. "This," he said, gesturing weakly to the room, "is just weather. I've stood through worse." A nurse entered briefly, checking vitals, offering a quiet Christmas greeting before slipping back out. The room returned to stillness. "I meant what I said," Franklin continued, voice steadier now. "Return to your post." Daniel inhaled slowly. "If I come back publicly, they'll try again. They'll find another angle." Franklin nodded. "They will, and this time, they'll fail." Daniel looked at him, searching for doubt, for hesitation. He found neither. "I've already signed the papers," Franklin said. "Transfer of operational authority. Temporary at first, then permanent. Witnessed, filed, public." Daniel froze. "Franklin—" "I didn't build Second Watch so it could be dismantled by whispers," Franklin interrupted, more force in his voice than the machine suggested he should have. "I built it so it could outlive me." Hawk lifted his head, ears twitching, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "You don't need my strength anymore," Franklin added quietly. "You need my name, and I'm giving it." Outside the hospital window, church bells rang softly, marking Christmas morning. 3 days later, Second Watch opened its doors. The old police station looked different now, not transformed beyond recognition, but restored with intention. Snow had been cleared from the steps. The reinforced roof stood solid, its scars visible but honest. Inside, the concrete walls remained bare in places, displaying framed photographs of past officers, handwritten duty rosters from decades earlier, and a simple wooden plaque near the entrance that read, "Second Watch, continue the call." People gathered slowly, carefully, as if unsure whether they were allowed to hope yet. Daniel stood near the entrance, dressed not in his patrol uniform, but in a simple dark coat. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, hands clasped loosely, posture straight but restrained. Hawk lay near the fireplace, his muzzle grayer now, his movements slower, but his presence unmistakable. Every so often, he lifted his head to watch people enter, tail thumping once in greeting. Franklin arrived last. A hush fell as his wheelchair was guided into the room. He wore his old sheriff's uniform, tailored decades ago, now fitting loosely across his frame. The badge gleamed softly under the lights. He looked smaller than he once had, but no less commanding. When he spoke, his voice carried easily. "This town taught me what service means," Franklin said. "Not power, not authority, responsibility. To stand when it's easier to sit, to stay when it's safer to leave." He gestured toward Daniel. "Second Watch needs a commander who understands that the call doesn't end when the radio goes quiet." Franklin placed a folded document into Daniel's hands. The transfer of leadership. Public. Final. Applause followed, restrained at first, then stronger. In the back of the room, a woman stood frozen just inside the doorway. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender, her dark coat dusted with snow. Her face held familiar lines softened by time and distance. Beside her stood a young boy, about 8 years old, clutching her hand tightly, eyes wide with uncertainty. Franklin saw them and inhaled sharply. "Claire," he whispered. Claire Moore, Franklin's daughter, had left Redwood Falls 12 years earlier after her mother's death, carrying unresolved grief and quiet anger she had never voiced. Life had pulled her elsewhere: marriage, divorce, responsibility. She had stayed away not because she didn't care, but because returning felt like reopening wounds she didn't know how to tend. She stepped forward now, eyes shining. "I heard about the storm," she said softly. "And the hospital." Franklin swallowed. "You came." Claire nodded, then gestured to the boy. "This is Evan, your grandson." Franklin's breath caught. He had seen photographs, distant and inadequate. Seeing the child in front of him, real, solid, was something else, entirely. Before words could fail him, Hawk rose. The German shepherd approached Evan slowly, carefully, lowering his head to the child's eye level. Evan hesitated, then reached out, fingers brushing thick fur. Hawk's tail wagged once, then again, more confidently. Evan laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that seemed to echo off the walls. For the first time that day, Franklin wept openly. Second watch settled into rhythm over the following months. Veterans came and went, some staying, some only passing through. Old patrol stories were shared. Silence was respected. No one was asked to explain why they needed the place. Daniel led without spectacle. He listened more than he spoke. He set schedules, not rules. Hawk aged gracefully, spending most nights by the fireplace, eyes half closed, ears still attuned to every shift in the room. Franklin lived 2 more years. He attended every major gathering, sometimes speaking, often just watching. When spring came, he rolled himself outside to feel the sun on his face, content in ways he hadn't been for decades. He passed quietly one April morning, surrounded by family, knowing the watch was covered. On the night of his memorial, snow fell again, unexpected, gentle. Daniel stood outside second watch, Hawk beside him, watching flakes drift down in the glow of the lights. The radio at his shoulder was silent, but in Redwood Falls, everyone knew. Snow does not only fall, sometimes it stands watch. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come softly through a loyal dog that refuses to walk away, through a broken man who chooses to stand again, and through ordinary people who keep serving, even when no one is watching. In our daily lives, we all face winters of the soul, moments of loneliness, loss, exhaustion, and doubt. Moments when it feels easier to give up than to keep going. But God never abandons us in those seasons. He sends help in ways we do not expect, through small acts of kindness, through faithful hearts, and through love that shows up without being asked. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel. And if you believe that God still sends quiet miracles into our lives, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and healing in every season of life. And please remember to press subscribe to support this YouTube channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and redemption. Thank you for walking this journey with us.